ahead and get this party started. Montreal, do you want to kick us off here? Maybe. Give him a second. Maybe struggling with technical issues. There he is. I see him. I can see you, but I can't hear you, Montreal.
Sorry about that. I was double muted.
Oh.
So my apologies. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First, I thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining. Thank you for helping to support the Southwest chapter. And so welcome to this quarter's quarterly technical safety meeting. My name is Montreal Walker. Those of you that do not know me, I am the current president for the Southwest chapter. And so, with that being said, just want to make sure that I bring a few things to the forefront just to make sure that everyone is tracking on some of the things that we have coming up here for the rest of this month. Um, on the 27th of March, if you're all not aware, the AIHA North Texas local section webinar will be taking place. You can register on the ASSP Southwest Chapter website if you're interested. The topic will be regarding heat stress. Then we also have another event, which the ASSP Region March webinar that we have on the 30th as well. If you're interested, please go online and register for that. And all of you know that in April, we will be having our PDC as well. And so with that, we'll be partnering with the Fort Worth chapter for the PDC. It's much anticipated, and we're all waiting very impatiently for the PDC next month. So it's going to be exciting. We have several good speakers lined up, so it'll be a very good event. So if you have not signed up, please do so. And then we have the Region 3 PDC, which is in September. It's actually going to be at SeaWorld this year. So if y'all need a reason to take a vacation, take the family to SeaWorld, September we'll be having the PDC for Region 3 in at SeaWorld. So uh, hopefully we'll see you all there. And so with that, I'm not going to belabor the point, and without further ado, this person goes without really much introduction because everyone knows her. Everyone loves her. She is the past president for the Southwest chapter and is now the regional director for Region 3. And so she's going to grace us with her presence and give us a amazing presentation. And so with that, put your hands together, show some love for the one and only Abby.
Wow, that was quite the introduction. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. I'm excited to share this presentation with you guys. I'll be giving this at a couple conferences later this year. So you guys are going to be the first ones privy to it. So exciting times. I will link in the chat towards the end, probably when we're wrapping up, two separate links. One is going to be like our roll call. It's a Google form. You'll just put your first name and your last name and then your email. And then there will be a second link that is going to be for the CEUs as well. So it's all kind of wrapped up part of that. So there's going to be two different forms that you'll need to complete, just name and email, and then just an evaluation of the meeting overall. And then I'll feed all that up and you guys will get your CEUs for being here today. So let's get into it. Let me share my screen here. Okay, I need to make sure I share my sound too. Okay. Oh, there's the form. So this is what you'll get. Which I just actually while Montreal was talking, I was like, oh crap, the forms. But here they are. So one of them will be the feedback form, and the other will be just the roll call form. So you'll have that towards the end here. But let me go ahead and get into my presentation. Of course, we're in Canva. You know me, I love Canva. Okay, so we are all here to talk about technical gaps in respiratory protection. So the breathing room. So where we have gaps between what's on paper and what's happening in reality. So that's going to be the gist of what we're talking about is that gap in particular. All right. So like we said, if you don't know me already, my name's Abby Holovach. I'm out of Fort Worth, Texas. Like Montreal said, part of the Southwest chapter. I'm also our current regional vice president for Region 3. Been in that role for going on a year now. So that's been a lot of fun working with all the different chapters. Currently, I'm the owner of Vibe Environmental. So I've been full-time with it since about last July, pretty much right when I started the RVP role. So it's been a whirlwind of the past, going on 8, 9 months. Previous to that, I was working at Holtcat as their environmental compliance manager. I also worked for a good chunk of time at a hazmat and spill response company. So especially a lot of the examples and things we talk about today are experiences I had there and just lessons learned. I also worked for a period of time at the Joint Reserve Base here in Fort Worth and started out my environmental career as a environmental investigator with TCEQ. So definitely gave me some good perspective into how regulators think and function as a whole. So those are just a few of my critters over there on the right. You may hear that is a chicken right there. You'll probably, I'm not going to say may, I can guarantee you probably will hear him crowing at some point. Anytime he hears like voices over the computer or the phone, that spurs him to start crowing. So he's a silky chicken. I've had him for about, I think he's going on 7 years now. His name is Harriet. We did not know he was a male when he was a day old chick. He just started crowing and we were like, well, there it is, 6 months into it. So you will definitely hear Harriet. All right. So like I said, our goal here is to talk about the differences between what's in our program and what's actually going on in the real world. So, we may have these beautiful respiratory protection programs. It checks all the boxes. It meets all the requirements, but we have to look at, again, what's actually happening out in the field. So that's going to be a big point of our discussion is not so much what's in your respiratory program, but again, bridging that gap, paperwork, and what's actually going on. So that's the whole point kind of our discussion. And if at any point anybody wants to jump in with a real world story or a piece of advice that everyone else may find helpful, feel free to come off mute and interrupt. I have no problem with that. I can't really see the chat when I'm sharing my screen like this. So if you've got something and you want to share it and you feel comfortable, please jump in because that's the point of this whole conversation is for us to learn and grow from each other. All right, so Oprah makes an appearance a few times here. I like my gifts with Oprah. But like we said, a lot of these respiratory programs look great on paper. We have these documented hazard assessments. We issue out respirators. We've got all our documentation for fit tests and medical evaluations. We've got all of our training records. So we're like, wow, things are looking good. We're feeling good about this. However, as we know, it doesn't equate to what actually goes on, boots on the ground. So just because our programs are compliant, that doesn't mean automatically that we have equal protection with those who are actually, living and breathing that program. So that's what we're going to look at. Like we said, those gaps that are going to quietly erode those safety margins. And that's how we end up with, these little issues that culminate into an exposure, some type of, serious medical situation. So those are the things, again, we want to look at and assess within our own programs and how they're actually being used out in the field before we ever have any type of actual issue. So it goes back to leading and lagging indicators. And we're really trying to focus on those leading indicators before we ever get into territory where we're having to deal with corrective action with the situation. So 3 main objectives here that we're going to talk about. First off, identify those common technical gaps. So that'll be a lot of what we discuss is what creates that false confidence where we feel good, like things are where they need to be, but maybe unbeknownst to us, or, maybe we're not privy to certain operations that go on. That's where these technical gaps arise. We'll look at real world work conditions. What's actually going to affect that respiratory protection in the field? So worker behavior, environmental variability, program assumptions that actually influence exposure in some of these activities that, again, maintenance, irregular operations that maybe there's more exposure than we had anticipated or than we were aware of. So we'll talk about some of those. And then last but not least, we'll talk about some things that you can actually apply today. So that framework for stress testing your respiratory protection program. So how can you today identify weak points in your program, again, and get ahead of it before we have an exposure or before we have some type of enforcement action? So those are kind of the three chunks that we're going to take it away with. So the issues we might see, what it looks like in the real world, and how do we resolve those? How do we identify them? So one of the most common issues we see, like we said, is that illusion of compliance where things look good in the office, but out in the field, it's a different story. So they meet those regulatory requirements, but we're not actually seeing them in practice. So things like outdated hazard assessments. Again, processes change. Data may change based off of, new constituents or chemicals that they're using. Maybe respirator selection based on convenience or what people are most comfortable with in terms of, utilization versus the actual exposure risk. And perhaps there's fit testing going on annually, yes, checking the boxes, but it's not actually reflecting real world conditions. So it's not actually representative of what they'll actually be facing out there in the real world. And again, those program elements look great in the office. They operate independently, but they're not actually integrated into the system. So that's what we're going to talk about. Again, ways that we can bridge that gap between paperwork and real world. So compliance creates the baseline, but protection requires that continuous technical verification, just like everything else we have to deal with in EHS. But in particular, respiratory protection, PPE use, we're dealing with a lot of human error. So that's a lot of things we'll discuss. All right, so let's kick it off with just two kind of case studies where things went wrong. So with respiratory protection, again, places that like DuPont, I'm sure they've got, very meaty respiratory protection program, but something still went wrong. This was in LaPorte. This was in 2014. There was a methyl mercaptan fatal exposure. So there was maintenance going on, again, an irregular operation on a pesticide production unit. So they had 4 workers who entered into that area during the release. And unfortunately, because of acute inhalation exposure, it led to 4 fatalities. So worst case scenario right here. So what went wrong? Workers entered that area without the appropriate respiratory protection because they didn't have their emergency response procedures clearly defined. So their hazard assessments may have addressed the day-to-day, but it didn't adequately address, again, worst case scenario here, during an irregular activity, what is that going to look like in the real world? So they weren't properly prepared with the right type of respiratory protection. They became overwhelmed and thus worst case scenario. So highly toxic gases in particular, or confined spaces, or anywhere where we're going to have these high concentrations, we've got to look at the worst case scenario. So our respiratory protection programs address not only just day-to-day routine operations, routine use, but we also, again, need to look at if there is an emergency, what are we going to need to change and do differently here and make sure our people are actually trained and aware of that shift.
DuPont Chemical Company and one of its employees pled guilty today to criminal negligence in connection with a deadly accident in LaPorte that left 4 people dead. KPRC2 investigator Joel Eisenbaum live in the newsroom now with those new developments. And Joel, it has been close to 90 years now since this happened.
Daniela, I remember covering this story when it happened, and it was a while back, November 15, 2014. That was the day 24,000 pounds of deadly methyl mercaptan was released. It's a gas. It happened inside DuPont's LaPorte chemical manufacturing facility. Now, 4 employees died during this while responding to that emergency. It all started when an employee accidentally left a piping valve open, leading to a cascading series of events the government says was preventable. Today, we learned the company and a guy by the name of Kenneth Sandel, a unit operations leader at the time, pleaded guilty and were sentenced for criminal negligence. Court records show DuPont and its employees ignored a federally mandated safety procedure. Prosecutors say Sandel should have known the danger was there. As for the punishment now, DuPont will pay a $12 million penalty and will serve 2 years of probation. That's essentially monitoring. The company also agreed to make a $4 million community service payment to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. That money, we're told by the government, will stay local, helping Galveston Bay. Kenneth Sandell, the operations leader, will serve 1 year of probation. As part of the pleas, DuPont and Sandell admitted to violating the Federal Clean Air Act. We're live in the newsroom. Joel Eisenbaum, KPRC 2 News.
All right, so there you go. As a result of, some irregular activities, that valve was left open, and hence worst case scenario. Now, another interesting example here is actually related to popcorn. So flavor manufacturing in particular, diacetyl popcorn lung. So this was kind of a period from 2000 to 2003 where investigations were underway related to popcorn, microwave popcorn, flavoring manufacturing. So they got bronchiolitis obliterans, which is this irreversible lung disease because they had been chronically exposed to diacetyl flavoring chemicals in the popcorn manufacturing facility. So some of these folks actually had to have lung transplants, and a few of them actually died because they, weren't able to recover from it. So at this point, it's pretty clear they hadn't recognized the hazard, essentially. So respirators were not being consistently used. Of course, it was not included in their hazard assessments in terms of those chronic inhalation risks. So this went on for years and years, until it culminated. Of course, chronic hazards are sometimes more difficult to identify, but in this case, they were able to link it back. So key lessons here. This is where things like toxicology come in as that information evolves. So that's where we got to get ahead of things. We may be waiting around for years and years for these definitive regulatory limits, but that's going to leave us unprotected for that entire term. So again, that's what goes back to these thorough hazard assessments in the real world, real operations. And there's actually, when we'll watch a quick clip on this as we wrap up these examples, just regular consumers were also getting the same popcorn lung. So the same exposure.
Now to the man who's waking up a multimillionaire thanks to that lawsuit that started with a bag of microwave popcorn. Wayne Watson scored a $7 million verdict after he says he developed what's known as popcorn lung after eating 2 to 3 bags of microwave popcorn every day. ABC's Clayton Sandell has the story.
For Wayne Watson, popcorn went from delicious to almost deadly. When we first met him in 2007, Watson was popcorn obsessed.
I ate about 2 bags a day, every day.
Every day for 10 years until his doctor diagnosed him with a rare disease, popcorn lung.
You cannot blow air out. The very small airways become blocked with scar tissue and inflammation.
Popcorn lung is usually found in plant workers exposed to high levels of diacetyl, a natural flavoring used to give popcorn that buttery taste. Watson sued the popcorn maker and the supermarket that sold it, claiming the companies never warned consumers that diacetyl, also recently linked to Alzheimer's disease, was dangerous.
They thought that no consumer would ever be exposed to enough of it to make a difference. Well, they rolled the dice and they lost.
A jury agreed on Wednesday, awarding Watson damages totaling $7.2 million. Watson says he plans on giving money to charity. One thing he says he won't be doing is buying microwave popcorn.
Probably look like a fairly healthy guy, but I only have, on a good day, about 53% lung capacity.
Many manufacturers no longer use diacetyl in microwave popcorn. Glister Mary Lee, the popcorn maker in this case, did not return calls for comment, but reportedly issued a statement saying it was disappointed with the jury's decision and is evaluating next steps, noting it has provided safe, quality microwave popcorn to consumers for 2 decades. For Good Morning America, Clayton Sandell, ABC News, Denver.
So that's crazy. You think about, that guy, like people say in the comments, he really liked his popcorn. It's a lot of popcorn to be eating, but then you think about those people that were actually working at that facility and were around that all day long, and that, of course, that's how they ended up needing lung transplants and everything else. So again, sometimes our standards may not be up to speed with the hazards that our personnel are actually facing.
Hey, Abby, this is Jennifer Sue. Can I make a quick comment?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, the fact that the consumer got $7.2 million, but anybody that's working in the facility is likely getting $0 outside of workers' compensation. And I mean, maybe full disability. I mean, if you can't breathe, you're not going to be able to do any physical work. I mean, that's absolutely devastating. And the fact that the news report says that the company feels that it was like basically a shame and they
Yeah.
don't agree with the verdict is so interesting. And I mean, one thing that just comes to mind, right? I know for me as having an industrial hygienist background, um, something that it always comes up is that, some folks they're really scared of the technicalities of like the industrial hygiene programs and the person I'm going to say, right, speaking personally, I know we might have some IHs on your call, but like everybody talks about like they don't want to necessarily know it. It's intimidating. Like the math is intimidating. And some of this really doesn't take any math whatsoever. It takes a logic to think, what do you have? If you have any chemical whatsoever, even if you don't have chemicals and you have dust, like that all requires an industrial hygiene mindset that is very easy to learn and grow. And then to put that together with the respiratory protection program information and realize like you can have a respiratory program just like you're talking about today, and then there are still gaps. Like within DuPont, I know that they have IHs. Within this popcorn company, guaranteed they probably didn't have anybody. The fact that they're like not even they have popcorn lung and yet they're still in business. I mean, that's ridiculous. From an
Yeah.
IH perspective, that would never be considered acceptable. But unfortunately, here we are today. It sounds like probably they're probably still in business. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of share that perspective because there are ways of doing this, there are ways of knowing and understanding. It's just that typically it comes down to a money thing, right?
Yep.
They want the money up the top, they want to get their earnings, but they do not care about the workers. It's about getting the product out the door and saying we're a family-friendly company. We had no idea that we could anticipate it. They don't want to know they can anticipate it, and they don't. They always express shock, time
Yeah.
after time. Yeah,
Yep.
thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, that's great insight. Like you said, it's crazy that that guy got 7 million, and you wonder how, the folks fared who are actually working in that facility. Yep. Great points. All right. So, of course, we know within our respiratory programs, like was just mentioned by Jennifer as well, we have these strong programs that could cover things like hazard evaluation. We got to include things like respirator selection based upon the hazards they're going to face. And we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes on how we actually make those determinations based upon our exposure assessments. Medical evals, fit testing, training, when they're supposed to be using them, whether it's required or optional, maintenance and storage, program evaluation, record keeping, all the things we're all very familiar with. Again, I'm not going to, beat a dead horse on the basics of respiratory protection because we all probably have in some way or another taken part in putting one of these plans together. But in theory, these elements are supposed to form this closed loop protection system. So we look from start to finish the full life cycle of potential respiratory usage. So again, in theory, things look great, but that's where program verification comes in. Is this actually happening out in the field, or are we missing something here? So this is where we see those gaps emerge. So between these elements rather than within them. So when we talk about failures with respiratory protection and with our programs, like I mentioned earlier, it's rarely from just one single mistake. Typically, it's these small assumptions, these small issues that accumulate over time, and then we end up with some type of catastrophic situation. So could be an incomplete hazard characterization or an incomplete hazard assessment. Again, we're missing parts of the operation. Some of these irregular activities. Could be incorrect respirator selection. They're not wearing the type of respirator that's actually going to provide the protection they need. We'll talk about assigned protection factors or APFs here in just a minute and kind of what that looks like, but how sometimes, again, we'll get a false sense of security with those. Could be poor integration between, like we just talked about, IH and that IH data and how that actually trickles down and is integrated into our program and the decisions in the field. And of course, real world practices may have it written one way on paper, but the guys are out there, the gals are out there doing it in a completely different way. And if we're only verifying our programs once or twice a year, and it's really kind of a desktop audit situation, there's a lot of things that we could potentially be missing. So when we have all these factors combined, that's how we reduce that margin of protection. That's where we see these gaps in our respiratory protection programs with that breathing room. So what do we mean when we say breathing room? So this refers to the margin of safety between the 1, actual airborne exposure, and 2, the protection level provided by the respirator. And I've had this happen before where people come back from jobs and they're like, oh, I started to like taste it in my mask. And I'm like, oh my God, no, you shouldn't be tasting anything up, anything in there. That probably means that your actual airborne exposure was higher than anticipated and it exceeded the protection level provided by the respirator. So now we've got a serious situation. You've potentially been exposed. So those are the things we obviously want to try to identify before that exposure ever actually takes place. So that margin is going to be influenced by variability in airborne contaminants and their concentrations, depending upon the activities. It may also be influenced by the worker's movement. So you may have some jobs where people are twisting and turning and, flipping all sorts of equipment around. And that task variability is going to make a big difference, especially when if maybe you're the one fit testing people, or, you're in charge of where they're being sent for fit testing. Goes back to, we want to make sure it's actually representative of their activities. Because if you've ever had to do like a qualitative fit test, they got to do things like, grimace inside the mask, make all those funky faces. They've got to, turn their head left and right. They've got to close their eyes and bend over. That was what I always tell the guys, and it'd freak them out. I'm like, no, not in a freaky way. Just we got to replicate some conditions here of you moving around and you're not seeing me as I'm giving you instruction. So, but again, that may not be sufficient testing in terms of their actual tasks they'll be doing. So they may be moving around a lot more than they actually are simulating during that fit test. So that could potentially be another area that we need to address. The environmental conditions. So, again, are they going to be sweating? Is it going to be cold? Is freezing? All of those things could potentially affect the fit of the respirator and how it functions. So programs that operate at the right regulatory limit, again, we're checking all the boxes, may leave little margin when conditions change. We're not flexible. We haven't actually included all of those potentials that may affect the respiratory fit and the respiratory protection. All right, bye, Ed. He's jumping off. All right, so technical gap number 1. So our hazard assessments don't reflect work reality. So our hazard assessments maybe rely on limited air sampling. Goes back to IH. Short-term monitoring. We're not sampling and we're not monitoring enough to even get a full picture of what's going on here. And then also maybe we're only doing it during under, again, ideal conditions, not when, there's any extenuating circumstances or, anything that isn't a regular activity. So we've got this very narrow-sighted focus of what respiratory protection looks like at our site with our operations. And we're failing to include other components, other activities and operations. So that's where it goes back to IH, because if we don't have good industrial hygiene programs, sampling, et cetera, it's going to directly affect your respiratory protection program. So real work environments, things we want to look at when we're assessing during our hazard assessments, task variability, all the potential they could be doing. And we want to replicate that kind of thing during fit tests, during, our hazard analysis. We want to look at that and include that variability. Maybe the irregular activities like seasonal changes, maintenance operations, all of those things could be a little bit different than they're just day to day. So that process variability. So we good hazard assessment that we want to shoot for captures not only average conditions, but also those peak exposures. Those are regular activities that are going to drive that actual risk. So exposure variability. So it could dramatically vary during a single work shift. And I've had to deal with this before, quoting facilities, and you're trying to tell them like, we're going to need a, sampling for this extended period of time with these different duties and these different roles. And you're trying to explain it to them. And they're like, why can't you just come and sample for 15 minutes? Like that's too expensive. Again, it goes back to what Jennifer said, it's about the bottom line in a lot of cases, and they're missing these potential exposures that go beyond just one person's regular shift. So could be things like, again, irregular opening process vessels. Tank cleaning operations is a big one, especially anytime we talk about confined spaces, because now we've got a lot of concentrated constituents and materials they could potentially be exposed to. Material transfers is another interesting one. I'll give you an example of that. When I was with the hazmat company, There were some guys up in Colorado, and they were in not a confined space. It was just like a utility equipment shed. It had two, like, doors, kind of regular doors. They weren't like big bay doors, but they had two, like 400 gallon of these tanks that were in there that had like an ammonia based material. So it was liquid, it was a slurry. So they were transferring from one tank over to the other tank because they were going to clean the first one. Well, as they're transferring that material, they start to notice low oxygen. So their monitor goes off and it's like at 17.2%. Like all of a sudden it just dropped like crazy. And they were in there with just full face respirators on because of the ammonia fumes. Well, at that point, then they had to completely stop the job and step out of that situation because if you know anything about respirators, an APR, air purifying respirator, is going to do nothing for you with low oxygen levels. It's just cleaning the air. It's not providing you with, fresh independent breathing source here. And come to find out, the reason for this was during this material transfer is because as they were stirring up that ammonia product, as it was transferring, like the hole where the hose was going into, there was about like 1 inch gap around it, and those vapors were coming out because it was being, stirred up, and it was displacing the oxygen in that shed. So they accounted for one hazard, which was exposure to these mild ammonia vapors and odors. But what they didn't account for was just how much it would be mixed in, stirred up during that transfer, so much so that those vapors became sufficiently accumulated in that space to push the oxygen out. So again, missed a critical component that could have potentially caused an exposure. Thankfully, they were able to get out of that situation easily, but could have been worse. So sampling data collected during those routine operations, we may miss something. And we want to make sure we catch it because that gap between our measured exposure and the actual exposure potential can grow.
Hey,
All right, so go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going to add just from the
yeah.
IH perspective. So
Yeah.
all that IH monitoring, because some folks might not realize, it's just a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
So that monitoring data that you get for that date and time, maybe it looks great and you're like, great, I don't have to worry about anything. And that's actually not necessarily true. You always have to think that maybe variation could be there. It could always get higher. It could be lower on some days, but you just always have to be prepared. So when you do select your respiratory protection, it's not just because like based just on that data, you have to know that you have, I would say, ability to have some buffer in there, right? In case it does get higher, in case something else does go wrong, that you're still able to have that protection for your workers.
Yep. And I think it's a good point too. And like you said, it's a snapshot in time. Maybe we plan to do sampling 1 month and then come back and redo it in, 2 months from now or whatever, and just maybe do different modules versus just one lone independent event. Because like you said, it could vary based upon day. So we don't ever just want to get comfy with that one single snapshot in time. So great point. Thank you, Jennifer. So maintenance, though, maintenance is always going to be a big one. We saw that with the DuPont incident. So routine operations, you may be like, oh, looks great. It's below our exposure limits. But during maintenance now, equipment is opened. Maybe valves that are not normally opened are now opened. There's residual materials, could become airborne. Ventilation systems that maybe circulate on a regular day, circulate and provide clean air, but now they may be offline. So now it may be concentrating. So those are some common things that we might see during these short duration tasks like maintenance, where we can have those high peak exposures that routine sampling, that snapshot in time did not capture. So this is a really common issue right here. Now, technical gap number 2. So this is where we select a respirator based on minimum compliance. Like we said, we're not accounting for the worst day or the bad day or any of that variability. So a lot of times we'll look at, okay, we've done our hazard assessment based off of that, based off the potential exposures. What's our minimum respirator that we're going to need to be able to utilize here in terms of compliance and protection? But when we go to the bare minimum, then we have to assume exposure estimates are accurate. Like we got to feel real confident in those. The fit got to be perfect because we don't have any wiggle room here. And those work conditions better not change. So again, that snapshot in time. Hey, watch out. Oh my God. One of my cats stepped on my chihuahua. I'm so sorry. And it got her really upset. Debbie is not a nice chihuahua. But again, all things we want to consider because these assumptions rarely hold true. We know things are going to change. So if we did our assessment and we choose just, oh, this right here will satisfy it, no problemo, we may be inadvertently opening our people up to an exposure or risk. So selecting respirators with greater protection margins can significantly reduce risk. But we will mention later towards the end, of course, we're not going to just go whole hog and put everybody in an SCBA because, we could be like, oh, worst case scenario. There is limitations to this. We don't want to create additional hazards because someone's now under heat stress and they didn't need to have that on in the first place. So we'll touch on that later, but just wanted to kind of note that. So we're all familiar with respirators. Again, I'm not going to sit here and talk to you guys like you never heard about a respirator, but we are aware that there are some respirators that are air purifying respirators. And my cat stepped on my chihuahua, quote of the day. Yep. In the chat. So we do have some air purifying respirators over here on the left-hand side. So these are just like our N95s. So our filtering face piece respirators. Then we've got things like half face, full face, and our PAPRs. So all of these are air purifying respirators. All they do for us or for our people is filter the air. And of course, different cartridges, different filters for different constituents. But nevertheless, like I mentioned earlier, low O2, these aren't going to do anything for you because all they do is filter the air for specific contaminants. And you got to know what the contaminant is to even choose the right filter. And then, of course, you have your atmosphere supplying respirators. So this could be like your typical SCBA. This could be some of the supplied air respirators. So I was checking the chat here. Oh, yeah, we'll talk here in just a minute about those who don't want to shave for their fit test. I think we've all been through that one. That's rough. But again, we got a wide variety of different respirators that we may need to utilize, and it's not going to be a one size fits all by facility, by operation. I've been to some facilities where just based off of comfort alone and the extent of time in the respirator, PAPRs were a better choice. Yeah, in terms of protection, they might have been overkill, but if you've ever had to wear like a half face or a full face, it is not a fun time. Wearing that for an extended period of time, it's very uncomfortable. So sometimes even things like worker comfort are going to come into play here because if they're more comfortable wearing it, they're more likely to wear it in the first place. So always going to come into the conversation. Now, when we're looking at what type of respirator do our people even need, that's where we start off, of course, with our hazard assessment. We look at what are they even being exposed to? And then we really want to have a good understanding of those assigned protection factors because different types of respirators are going to have a different APF. So this is where we look at things like going old school OSHA, permissible exposure limits, PELs, based upon our industrial hygiene data. So as we know, a PEL represents the max allowable exposure to hazardous substances over that 8-hour workday. So this is just like meeting the bare minimum here. And anytime we exceed that PEL, now we're going to have some type of control in place. Another thing we'll touch on later, as we all are very well aware, we never just jump straight to PPE. We're always going to try other things like engineering controls, et cetera, before we get to that point. But our conversation here is the fact maybe you've already tried all that and you've got to use some respiratory protection still. So a common PEO we might deal with be like benzene, 1 ppm. That is its 8-hour time-weighted average. So we got to have this basic information, our PEL, and what our IH data actually tells us before we can ever even decide what kind of respirator our people need to wear. So what is an APF? So assigned protection factor. So this tells us what is the expected level of protection provided by that respirator when used properly. Keyword properly. So APFs that we'll see. So an N95 has an APF of 10. Half face mask of 10. Full face 50. PAPRs can go all the way up to 1,000. And a supplied air respirator like an SCBA is up to and over 1,000. And basically what it's saying is it's cutting the contaminant you're exposed to by that APF value. So by 10, by 50, by 1,000, whatever it may be. But of course, like we said, this relies upon those basic assumptions of proper fit. They've been trained on how to actually wear it properly. Maintenance, it's being stored properly, cleaned properly. All of that is going to affect the assigned protection factor and the level of protection that respirator can even grant you. So, like I said, when you're asking, okay, what does that mean in APF? So that means the respirator reduces exposure to 1/10 of the airborne concentration, or 1/50th, or 1/10,000, 1,000, whatever it may be. So when we're looking at an APF value and that PEL, you've already determined. So this is how they both work together. So this lets us know what respirator at a bare minimum we're going to need. This is the formula. So required APF, measured exposure from your IH data, divided by the PEL. So we choose a respirator with an APF equal to or greater than that result. So let's do an example. So let's say your measured benzene concentration. You've gone out, you've done your data collection, you've gone out and monitored, it's 100 parts per million. Well, OSHA's PEL is 1 part per million. So we're going to have to do something here. Maybe you've tried all the engineering controls and all your hierarchy of controls. Well, what PPE do they need? Getting back to our equation, in this case, very, very basic. Our measured exposure is 100. Our PEL is 1. So our required APF protection factor is 100. So if that, number right there tells you anything, basically it's saying anything less than a PAPR, and you need to check what kind of PAPR you're using, is not going to provide sufficient protection here. So if someone comes to you and says, oh, we can use full face respirators with, these VOC filter cartridges, etc., that may not be sufficient here. And it's not looking like it's going to be sufficient based off the math. So this is the data we have to make these educated decisions in what is actually in our program and what's actually being used out in the field based off of that IH data and these PELs. So that's how we make these determinations, is based off of that assigned protection factor and what they're actually facing out in the field. But of course, we know a lot of times respirators deliver less protection than the assigned APF. Could be because of improper donning. They're not putting the respirator on properly. Can anyone tell me why the hot dog man is pointing at that GIF saying wrong? Take a good look at that guy's respirator situation. His suit is tucked under the mask, which I find incredibly disturbing. So this was actually from like a PPE company. They made all of these GIFs, and he's put it on over the suit. Exactly. And so this PPE company put out tons of these GIFs with this guy, and like in different suits, different respirators, and all of them, his freaking mask is tucked. I'm like, what is happening right now? Obviously, that's going to affect the seal, but it also affects if they're having to get like decontaminated after an incident. The respirator is the last thing you take off. So like, one of the last things. So good luck trying to get all the rest of your suit off when you've put the mask on over the suit. So obviously that's going to play a huge factor in the protection of the respirator, because now we don't have a seal. Facial hair interference. We'll talk about this one in just a minute. Obviously that's a chronic issue I think a lot of us have faced. Same for movement during worker tasks. And this is why I say, if you are involved with your respiratory fit testing procedures, really, really make sure they are moving all over the place during that fit test. We don't want just somebody coming in and being like, moving real slow and like gingerly. I need you whipping in a whirling and a twisting and a turning, because we need to make sure that thing stays on. Same for if there's sweating, there's talking. And filter loading, I mentioned that one earlier. So sometimes if a filter's been used for too long, it can exceed that filter's capacity to filter anymore. So all of those things are going to, basically make that APF a moot point. If I could click. Oh, there we go. So field studies have proven this. Workplace protection factors frequently fall below what they expect in the lab. So what they can predict. And again, that's why we really want to have a full picture hazard assessment here and not just default to the bare minimum. So fit testing versus fit in the field. Like we said, fit testing may be representative of a chill day, controlled conditions, but we want them to get aggressive. We want some whipping around, because they're rarely going to remain stationary during an actual task. So make sure during those fit tests that they are actually moving, versus just, like we said, being real gingerly and slow about it. We want it to replicate real world. Otherwise, it's not going to guarantee continuous protection. Now, the big one here, of course, is the facial hair. So this is one of the most documented, well-documented causes of respiratory leakage, because even a small amount of hair, that's stubble, can reduce that effectiveness dramatically. So, somebody, I guess I'm not a man, I don't know how fast hair grows on your face, but stubble growth during long shifts, maybe somebody's on a 12-hour shift, and they just grow hair really fast. Different types of facial hairstyles, as we're well aware, all of those could potentially be issues that are going to interfere with that seal. So this is one of the biggest challenges, is trying to convince people to part with their facial hair. So I made this fake movie poster when I was working at the hazmat company, because the most drama stemmed out of this. And one of you guys commented in the chat, you had like 20 people quit trying to get them to shave for an N95 fit test. But these are based off of real world quotes. But my fiance told me I can't shave. This beard is really important to me. I could just grease up my beard with Vaseline to make the seal. The fit test, one bearded man's inspiring story of love and loss and finding the strength to shave on fit testing day. It really is this dramatic. So it is no joke. And it got to the point to where I was so frustrated that I like playing practical jokes anyways, but I played a joke and it was probably kind of mean and unprofessional, but at the same time, I laughed so hard I almost threw up. So I made these fake posters or signs, and I put them in their break rooms that said, attention, starting August 1st, all field employees must have clean shaven heads, either shaved or waxed. This is for your protection. And then, oh my God, the flood of calls that came in. I'm not shaving my head. And then one of the guys caught wind that it was a joke, and he starts bald photoshopping people and sending these photos around to like freak everybody else out even more. And so then I got in on the action, and but it was my way of kind of at least making myself feel better. I was like, oh yeah, let me give you a little bit of that. So, but they all got over it and it was funny. So got to have some humor about it, or else it'll get really frustrating. But because it is a major, major cause of breakthroughs that we'll see. So I've literally had someone walk in with a greased up beard. Yep. See, there you go. They really think that'll work. All right. So technical gap number 4. So this is a big one for those APRs, or those air purifying respirators, cartridge and filter selection. So if we don't have the right filter or the right cartridge, you might as well not even have one at all. So it really depends on, of course, hazard identification. And that's going to lead directly into what type of cartridge we're going to use. So common gaps we might see. So misidentification of the contaminant type. They think they're going to face some type of VOC, and come to find out it was actually some type of acid material. Well, they might as well not have the respirator on, because it's not going to do anything for them. Lack of change out schedules. We got to have a schedule. We'll talk about this in a minute in terms of frequency. Or improper use of combination cartridges. So again, they're just not properly using the respirator equipment, and thus we're losing out on our level of protection. So if those cartridges are not appropriate for the hazard, we have no meaningful protection. So of course, cartridges come in all sorts, different types. We've got everything from acid gases to combination like acid gases and organic vapors, some that are for particulates only, some that are for chlorine gas. And of course, it's written on the side of each cartridge, but it also, color codes it, just makes it easy to identify. Like this guy over here has yellow acid gases and organic vapor cartridges on. You'll also notice a lot of them will also have an additional layer to them. And that's a particulate layer. Like the ones this guy has on in the photo, those are just for vapors only. They're like the thin version. But if it's got like the fatness to it, and it's got an additional layer, a lot of times it's kind of that pink or purpley color, that's an additional particulate filter. So another layer of protection. So if they're dealing with particulate, they may need that in addition to vapor protection. So that's why we gotta have the full picture here, even with our cartridges. So not only with the respirator, but also with the cartridges. But we can see cartridge breakthrough. I mentioned that earlier, where, depending on the contaminant concentration, could even come down to humidity and temperature, that could exceed that cartridge in that filter media. And now they're potentially huffing that in. So they may unknowingly use those cartridges beyond their protective capabilities. So if you've got people that have been using the same cartridges for the past 2 years, you probably have a situation going on. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing in the regulations that really says how often we have to change these out. And the manufacturer is not helpful really either. So this is coming from 3M. How long does a filter last? So things like we're really just having to like rely upon context clues going upon their recommendation here. When the breathing resistance becomes excessive, so if they're having to breathe a little bit harder, there's damage that's occurring. Maybe the filters and cartridges themselves have become damaged. It's unhygienic. I've been on some job sites where those cartridges are like covered in mud and, all this other grime. And you're like, there's no way it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So we really have to look at the situation, look at the workplace, and look at the concentration of the contaminant they're being exposed to and how they're being used, because this is really going to be a site by site thing in terms of how often they need to change these out. So if you're looking for a definitive answer somewhere, you're not really going to find one. So that's why, again, it goes back to the real world and how it connects to your program. And there's little things you can do to help with this, like having your employees write the date and time installed on that cartridge with a Sharpie. So everyone knows, okay, if my frequency is every 2 months, I've got the date on here. It's a good reminder versus it being a guessing game. And they're like, oh, I don't really remember when I put these on here. So there's little things we can do at least once we establish the frequency to make it that much easier for folks to be able to remember. Now, another technical gap we might see here, wrapping up some of our gaps, we'll move into some solutions. So again, those programs that operate in isolation. So it's a separate administrative system. It's not connected maybe to that industrial hygiene data. It's operating independently and they should be connected. Maybe your training programs are also not reflective of those real world exposures. And so they don't even realize or know what they're getting into. And your fit testing programs. Again, you might have a kind of a chill fit testing procedure. You're checking the boxes, but it's not actually commensurate to those job tasks. And especially if we see changes in those job tasks. So a good respiratory program is going to connect basically to all of the EHS elements and beyond. So obviously safety, industrial hygiene, got to get operations involved, got to get maintenance involved. We have to have all of those different inputs and all those different facets to have a truly hardy program that's going to survive in the real world. So we'll see our programs drift, of course, over time. Oh, and we got Oprah. She's back. So new chemicals could introduce new hazards that we've not accounted for. And especially if we've not already made like maintenance aware, hey, if you have changes, please let us know. We're going to have to update the respiratory program. And now there's these things happening in the background, in the peripherals, potential exposures we've not even been aware that we need to account for. Maybe there's a change in the process, how they're transferring, how they're pumping, how they're mixing. That could increase airborne contaminants, and we need to make sure it's captured within our plan. Maybe we've got a lot of new people in terms of workforce turnover. Maybe it's even our in-house trainer that could affect that training consistency. And then, of course, things like changes in job tasks, which goes back to looping in operations. So without periodic technical review, and we bring in all these other parties like maintenance, like operations, that's where a program may become misaligned with actual hazards. So this is where we see that cumulative risk. Each individual gap may look small, but they build, and then we've got significantly reduced protection levels. Maybe we slightly underestimate the exposure. Maybe, we've chosen that minimum respirator. We've not really gone through and looked at the assigned protection factors and our PELs and looked at that full picture together. Maybe there's fit degradations in terms of, how people are wearing their respirators, how they're storing them. Maybe you don't have that rotation of changing out those cartridges. All of those things combined goes back to what we said earlier, can reduce that true safety margin to near zero, because now we potentially have an issue where we've got one problem, we got two problems, we got three problems, and maybe one wouldn't have messed you up or caused an exposure, but if you got three of them together, now you're in a situation. So that's what we want to stress test. So this is where we're moving into our third component here. So a practical approach to identifying weaknesses is to stress test our own program. So what happens if our assumptions are wrong? Yeah, we got to look at it from an outside perspective. And I always say this when I, give an environmental training as well. We want to look at it from an outsider's view. That's how we find holes. That's how we poke holes. So our exposure estimate's conservative. We go back and we look at that industrial hygiene data. How was that information collected? How was it sampled? When? Who? All of those questions. Are respirators selected with that margin of error? Those things like the facial hair, like improper fit in terms of they're moving around a lot more than when they were fit tested. And our workers actually trained, really looking at our training program. And that's where we can poke some holes there as well, because that's where it really all starts. So stress testing helps us identify our problems before we actually have a problem or an exposure event. So stress test question number 1, what is the worst credible exposure? So of course we always ask, what's our day-to-day? What's our typical exposure level? But we want to flip the switch and ask, what's the highest exposure that could reasonably occur during the job task? So we want to think about when it's about to go down, what does that look like? And design respiratory protection based off that credible worst case scenario, not just average conditions. And make sure your people are trained on that too. They know, what does regular day look like? What does credible worst case scenario look like? That way they're not running around like chickens with their head cut off when that happens. Stress test question number 2. What happens if that seal degrades? So again, worker movement, sweating, extended wear, fatigue, the facial hair, wearing their PPE improperly. It's, getting in the way of the seal. Programs shouldn't assume that perfect respirator fit is going to be what's going on out in the field. We know this, and we need to account for the wiggle room, for the gaps. Oh, I hope Harriet didn't hear that. Chicken with his head cut off. Yeah. Harriet will actually eat chicken. When we bake chicken, Harriet is like looking for a piece. So he's a cannibal chicken. All right, but we want to select higher protection factors so we can compensate for that real world variability. Give yourself the wiggle room. Give yourself that, like when you're filling up a drum, we always leave a little bit of headspace in case you have vapor accumulation. Same thing here. Give yourself that headspace in case you have these issues and some of these other, potential factors. You're not teetering on the edge. You're still okay and you're still in the safe zone. Stress test question number 3, are we accounting for that non-routine work? So some of those activities we only do sometimes. And this goes back to having conversations with maintenance and operations, because there may be things going on that you weren't even aware was a thing that was going on. So I'll give you an example. I was one company I worked for, I just happened to see a maintenance man using a bulb crusher inside of a Connex box with a filter that had last been changed and God knows when, like on the actual like filter crushing unit itself. So, this guy's over here crushing mercury vapor bulbs. So what's going to happen if, first of all, his bulb crusher filter is 18 years old? It's not filtering mercury vapors out. So what's happening to those mercury vapors? They're probably accumulating inside the Connex box. So it was at that point, I had to shut him down because for an environmental perspective, you got to have some permits for actually crushing bulbs like that. But second of all, it's like, dude, you're in there huffing those mercury vapors potentially. And if I hadn't just happened to see that guy doing that, I wouldn't have any idea that was even going on and that there even was a potential exposure for that. So again, that's why we really want to loop in maintenance, operations. What are some of these non-routine work activities we've not accounted for? So that could make a big difference in our program. Question number 4, are filters being changed in time if you do have these air purifying respirators? So look at the change out schedules that you have in place, if you even have them. Does your workers, do they understand them? Again, make it easy for them. You're writing dates, making it easy to have, these little reminders. And then, of course, making sure supervisors are well trained. Are they actually enforcing them and keeping their eyes out for it as well? So those cartridge life assumptions, we want to make sure they're actually validated through contaminant concentration data, though, because like we mentioned earlier, it could exceed the ability of that filter to actually filter out the contaminant if that concentration is above the assigned protection factor, in particular of the respirator as well. So we got to look at not only the respirator we're using, the filters we're using, the contaminants present, and what that worst case looks like for you at your facility. In stress test question number 5, does the program reflect worker behavior, real life? So a lot of our programs assume perfect compliance, but in reality, we know things go on, like workers may remove a respirator briefly, may loosen their straps during work. It's uncomfortable, it's tight. Maybe they're using those filters longer than they should. They're not storing them properly. Those are all things that are going to degrade and scratch over time at our program that we thought looked great, but now we've got this gap we didn't intend for. So we want to understand that real world behavior and design our program based off of that with those protection levels integrated, accounting for those human factors. So we can evaluate your respiratory program today. You can go back and ask yourself things like, are exposure assessments based on the highest credible exposure, not just average conditions? If the worst case happens here, what does that look like? And do my people know what to do? Does respirator selection include that margin for uncertainty? All those human factors, all those potential field factors, did we consider that with our respirator selection within our program? Are maintenance and non-routine tasks evaluated? Again, bring in maintenance, bring in operations, have them look at the program, the plan, and may be surprised. They may point out things you didn't even know that they were doing. Get your cartridge schedules set. Does it rely on actual data versus just some of these, suggestions that were put out there like odor detection or, it becomes harder to breathe through the mask. We don't want to have to get to that point. So we want to establish that well ahead of time. And does your program actually account for how the workers are actually performing their job? Because if anything here is going to screw your program, it's going to be that human error. Things, again, we didn't account for, and it screws with our margin of error. So if we can't answer these questions confidently, you may have some hidden protection gaps that you'll need to assess. So closing those gaps requires better exposure characterization. Again, we want the full picture. Conservative respirator selection, leave that wiggle room. Strong cartridge change-out programs. It's something we've thought about, we've trained on, and we've accounted for. And we've really brought in that IH data because that really should be the heart of your respiratory program, is that IH data. Because that's telling you what are they being exposed to. Now I can compare that to the PEL. Now we can determine what respirators they need to use. Now we can determine if they need, if you're using an APR, what filters they're going to use. So it all starts there. And then, of course, frequent program evaluation. Like we said, once a year may not be good enough depending on your activities. You may want to take it into a once a year tabletop, but a once a year in addition to that, field comparison, field evaluation. Is this actually real world? Because our program needs to evolve as the workplace changes. So that IH data, as we've mentioned, though, again, it's at the heart of everything we're talking about, should function as that continuous feedback loop because it's going to give us data like, do we need to reassess what respirators we're using? Looking at our assigned protection factors. Engineering controls, are they effective? Do we need to change something up there? What about our training program, depending on the results of the IH data? And how are we going to adjust our program based off that? So it should never become a static program. And we really want to have IH interwoven because that's where it all starts. Now, I mentioned this earlier, of course, and I just felt compelled to say this. When we talk about respirators, like I mentioned before, it's not our primary control. We're always going to go through the hierarchy of controls, elimination, substitution, engineering, administrative. Finally, last line of defense is our PPE. So, of course, that's part of our respiratory program, part of our evaluation. What engineering controls, local exhaust ventilation, process enclosures, automation, substitution of hazardous materials that maybe have less respiratory hazards. But then again, we think worst case scenario, what happens if the local exhaust goes down? What happens if something, part of this automated process isn't working? That's a real world situation you may face. So you want to make sure that's accounted for in your program. So respirators, of course, are most effective when they've been layered with all of these other components, which you guys are all well aware of. So with our risk-based approach, kind of wrapping it up here. So we want to use our respiratory protection appropriate for the actual hazard, but we're going to avoid excess hazards as well, creating those excess hazards, like wearing an SCBA when it's not appropriate. So applying that risk-based approach, keeping that as our full perspective, match PPE to the actual exposure hazard. So I just want to throw that in there as well. So we're not just going to bump it up to the highest level of respiratory protection just in case, because that's where we could introduce secondary hazards like heat stress, reduced mobility, dexterity. And if it's not really necessary, again, we don't want to have to, add them excess burden because it's exhausting wearing a lot of this gear. If it's not necessary, we don't want to have to do it. So with our audits and reviews, again, doing it regularly here, evaluating start to finish from an outsider's perspective, hazard assessments. How are we selecting our respirators? How are we doing our fit test? How are we training our people? And then does all of that coordinate to exactly what we're seeing out in the field? Because observing out in the field is going to reveal things that we had no idea was going on. So quick diagnostic tool you can utilize, and I am going to share after the fact this presentation with you guys. So that'll be sent out as well as a Google Drive link. It'll have this PDF in here, as well as some guidance documents and some helpful templates. So you maybe want to come back and reference this, and then the next slide I have before we wrap it up here, that'll be in there for you. But so if we see things like same respirator issued for every task, it could mean maybe your hazard assessments have been oversimplified. Maybe cartridge replacements are based on smell. That would just mean your breakthrough protection and your systems you have in place are unreliable. Respiratory program hasn't changed in years. Clearly, that's not going to reflect current operations. Fit testing is treated like a paperwork exercise. Again, we're just checking the boxes. We're not actually kind of challenging them to what it would be like out in the field. Well, now our protection may be lower than assumed. Or maybe respirators are just being used everywhere. It's the first thing we go to. Well, our engineering controls may be insufficient. So those are just a few quick diagnostic things we can look at. And now this is where you can really kind of dig into. And even if you only pick 2 of these to get started, it could prove to be very helpful in assessing where your respiratory program is today. So things like hazard assessment, common technical gap you might see, exposure evaluations based only on routine operations. Field indicator could be air monitoring was conducted only during normal operations. So your risk here is going to be peak exposures during maintenance or upset conditions could exceed the respirator's protection factor. So guidance in this case include maintenance tasks, cleanings, shutdowns, emergencies in your hazard evaluations. Some other ones that we have here could be things like program integration. Industrial hygiene data is not connected to the respiratory program. Respirator types remain unchanged for years. Program drifts away from actual hazards. Create trigger points for program reassessment when processes change. So again, you can come back and reference this. I'm not going to read through every single one, but this is just kind of a helpful way, even if you just pick 2, to go back and reassess your respiratory protection program and where it stands now. So this is just something, again, some actionables that hopefully you'll be able to utilize in your workplace. So our key takeaways. Respiratory protection programs often appear compliant, but we've got those technical vulnerabilities. We've got those human error vulnerabilities. Those small gaps in hazard assessment, respirator selection, fit, cartridges. That's where we see accumulation of problems and see that reduction of real protection. So if we can stress test our programs, question all of our assumptions, and really integrate and tie in IH data, that's how we get these programs that provide that true level of protection rather than just regulatory compliance and checking those boxes. So our goal is not simply compliance. We want to create that breathing room where it matters most. And that is like our headspace in the drum, our breathing room. We've got a pad, we've got a buffer. In case the worst does happen, we've already planned it out and we've already accounted for it. So this is a document that is, and a couple others that are within the Google Drive. So a few things like a checklist for your program, a whole guidance document if you just want to, reassess your program overall. So there's like 4 or 5 different things in there, as well as a PDF of this presentation. So you'll have some goodies after the fact if you want to go back and reference it. And with that, I am done. Does anyone have any questions, anything that they want to throw out there?
Hey, Abby, this is Jennifer again.
Yeah.
Sorry. One thing that sticks in my mind that you mentioned, and I want to just like help emphasize that to the attendees today. So the emphasis that folks believe they should only be clean shaven for the fit test is definitely something that cannot be like understated. Like it happens so frequently, but just like everybody needs to have confidence as safety professionals to know that if the employee does not want to shave during the fit test, they are not shaving when they are required to wear it during whatever that hazardous operation is. And if they are not doing it, then they're basically wearing a costume. They're literally checking the box. And you might as well tell them that they should just walk into that room without the respirator because they're not getting the protection they need. And so if they are not willing to actually do that. And they want to have the psychological comfort of wearing a mask that is not truly protecting them because they refuse to shave or refuse to be clean shaven in the spaces that they need to be. Because we're talking about inches, right? Which obviously
Yep.
can be important to some people. But I think that it's very important to emphasize if they're not getting the protection they need, that respirator is doing no good for them. And this might be
Yep.
something, a conversation you need to have with your HR and supervisors and leaders of your organization, because I have had some folks that are truly willing to die on that hill. If they don't want to wear the respirator or they don't want to shave, then they shouldn't have to shave. And then the response that you need to give is, well, they cannot do that job because
Yep.
job requires that PPE because you have proof, maybe by IH data, that shows they're getting exposed to that levels. If you do not have enough engineering controls, administrative controls in place, you are accommodating everything in your facility process-wise to accommodate one employee. And if that's not something that you're willing to do, and the legal team is willing to, defend, allow this to kind of continue, then that's something that everybody gets to get uncomfortable with just for this one person. And I'm not saying I'm not a fan of accommodating individuals for their individual medical conditions or anything like that, but that is like a different conversation of like, you don't want to shave or you don't want to follow those, what is required according to what your EHS professionals have stated, as opposed to being like, hey, I'm just not, capable of doing something else because of some other maybe disability or issue like that. But I just
Yep.
wanted to, I mean, I think this was a phenomenal presentation, Abby. And so like I just wanted to make sure everybody kind of understands like that is one of the most critical pieces, having that conversation with your teams on
Yep.
what it actually means.
Yep. I mean, and it's almost one of the hardest things to have to battle. And I know that sounds like melodramatic, but all of these other things, a lot of it we have within our control in terms of like, getting IH data and like, figuring out the assigned protection factors and blah, blah, what respirators, all of this stuff. But trying to get somebody to shave their face, especially when you don't have management support. Like I had that, at the hazmat company, everybody there had a giant beard, and I'm like, we need them to shave. And then the supervisor I'm talking to looks like Santa Claus. I'm like, this feels like a losing battle, and it's like you can't hold them down and shave them. As much as you'd like to, but I think it is one of the bigger challenges for us. Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, Jennifer, what we're looking at in the chat. Because like was brought up, there are some facial hair that are acceptable. That's why a lot of times you'll see firefighters with like the horseshoe. That's why they all have the same facial hairs because they want facial hair, but it needs to be able to fit within the respirator seal. So, if you're looking for the chin curtain, the mutton chops, no, it's not gonna work for you. The Fu Manchu, no, no can do. So, but yeah, I
And
appreciate that, Jennifer.
one thing that you can do, and this is not necessarily a plug, but it's something that is available. But like 3M has in the past at least sent out individuals to perform fit testing on your behalf. I remember working with one gentleman and I really liked him. I mean, he held the line because he's like, no, these are 3M products. I'm representing 3M. I am not going to allow you to pass this test
Yeah.
unless you have certain facial hair orientations. And so it went from me having the conversation to him, a gentleman, having the conversation with, the majority males that were going through this fit testing. And, he made them work, but he made them work harder than I made them work, which I thought was like a testament during fit testing. Because
Yeah.
I always tell people like during like the bending down part, because they're like, oh, it's so silly. And I'm like, no, bend down, like you're going to pick something off the ground. You're not supposed
Yeah.
to because, in a pharmaceutical company, you don't. But, you have to pretend like you're doing real tasks or you're going to talk
Yeah.
to somebody, you're turning your head to talk to somebody, you're turning around to grab something off a table and, making them work for it. And so having, a representative that will perform the fit test for free if you're using their products is really
Yep.
helpful to having that conversation and making sure that everybody understands specifically, what is at stake.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, kind of getting that level of separation, you know. It's like a kid's going to act better when a stranger reprimands them than their own mom, you know, or whatever. At least a lot of kids will be that way. It's kind of a similar thing, you know, since it helps to have that third party. So, anybody else got anything? I did drop in the chat both links. So if you could go in, again, that's how I'm going to be able to get you your CEUs. I dropped the links right before the beard conversation. Can you see the chat when I'm sharing my screen? I don't know if you can or not. Go up to 1241 in the chat.
Yes.
And both links are there. And for the materials I referenced that I'll be sending out based upon the email you put in there, I'm just going to send a group email with all of this in there. Oh, David said he switched links. Okay, or switched computers. I'll drop the links in again if you need it. One. There's two. All right, both of them are in there. They are different. One is for like the roll call and how I'll get you guys the after meeting documents, and then one is an evaluation. Oh, no, no worries.
Awesome job, Abby. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
Excellent
thank you
presentation.
guys. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that.
Great job, Abby. This was perfect timing for me.
Oh, good. Good.
Reviewing our respiratory program as we speak. So
Oh,
definitely
wow. There you go.
fun conversations.
Yeah, very nice.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. And keep your eyes out on our LinkedIn page, on our website, 'cause we'll have more stuff coming up. But yeah, I'll just kind of sit here for a few minutes with the links in there in case you still need to grab them. But yeah, thank you guys. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Abby. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Abby. You're awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks again, Abby.
Thank you.
Abby, could you handle a really last minute question?
Sure.
I've been researching. We are actively updating our respiratory protection program, and we've got some internal debate as to whether a voluntary use respirator, like you're in a shop, there's no dust, but a person just wants to avoid the dust. Are they able, do we call it an N95, or does the N95 require the full respiratory fit process?
They could wear the N95. That's not necessarily an issue with voluntary respiratory use. Where basically, you guys have determined there's no actual respiratory hazards, there's no exceedances or exposures. They're just wearing it because it's voluntary.
Yes,
in that
yes.
case, they don't have to be fit tested.
Right.
But they do have to be medically evaluated just in case it doesn't create an additional hazard. And they do also you have to have this on file that they have been provided and read. I hope I don't mess up which appendix it is. I think it's Appendix D. I was going to say B.
As a David.
Thank you. Yeah, Appendix D. So it's basically just like 1.5 pages, but you would want to have that on file for anyone voluntarily wearing it.
So let me repeat this back. And I could find that we don't need the respiratory fit. There is no way to do voluntary without doing the medical testing first, correct?
Right. Yeah. And the basis of that, of course, is, just they don't want it to create an additional hazard where this person's got something wrong with them and then they collapse in there with it on or something like that. So.
Okay. So, okay. Well, that helps so much. Appreciate it. Both of you. Have a great, safe day.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. D for David. Appreciate that. Appendix D.
Appendix D. Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.